here on the main stage, I am very thrilled to introduce our next speaker. He is an advisor and consultant to international organizations, think tanks, governments, and businesses, including G20, the OECD, the European Commission, the United Nations, and several Fortune 500 companies. He's also an op-ed contributor to the Financial Times, Scientific American, and the Wall Street Journal, where he's written on economics of artificial intelligence, the history of technology, and the future of work. His most recent book, The Technology Trap, was one of the Financial Times best books of the year in 2019. So, speaking today on Technequality, winners and losers of technology in the workplace, please welcome Dr. Carl Benedikt Frey, Director of Future of Work, Oxford Martin Citi Fellow, Oxford Martin School. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you very much for that kind and warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today and having the opportunity to share with you some of the research that we are doing at the Oxford Martin School, where we try to understand how technology is reshaping the labor market and what that means in terms of income inequality, in terms of productivity growth, and in terms of its societal implication. Because what we do know is that historically, automation has had both winners and losers. And a key question, which I try to answer in my latest book, The Technology Trap, is that should we feel reassured if the future of automation mirrors the past? Because we've been through very different episodes of technological change. Some have been more replacing in terms of putting pressure on workers' wages in existing industries and occupations, and some have been more enabling in terms of creating more new jobs and industries that demand more workers. And a key point, which I think is often missed, is that periods of more labor replacing technological change have historically seen more social and political unrest. And quite often, actually, the losers to technological change try to introduce various measures to block the introduction of new technologies. And historically, the ability to succeed has in large part depended on the distribution of political power and whether those who stood to lose from technological changes had sufficient political clout actually to block the introduction of these technologies. For a long time before the Industrial Revolution, for example, craft guilds controlled production in Europe and also in Asia. And we see that they were quite successful in resisting many new technologies that they believed threatened their skills. And as a consequence, economic growth was slow for a long time. Luddite efforts to avoid short-term disruption in the labor market meant that people were also denied some of the long-term benefits that came with new ideas that had the potential to occur. And we are now living through a new period of labor replacing technological change, which is likely, I shall argue, to accelerate with COVID-19. And in this light, I think it is important to remember that resistance to technological change during replacing episodes have been the historical norm rather than the exception. If technological progress was inevitable, the first industrial revolution would have happened a bit earlier in human history. It would probably have occurred several centuries before it actually first took off in Britain, because there was nothing particularly complicated with the technology itself. In fact, in part of the steam engine, most of the technologies that made the first industrial revolution in terms of the spinning jennies and Crompton's mule, and you can think of various inventions, were actually not that technically sophisticated. They could easily have been made already around 1500, but resistance was one of the reasons that technological change was slow to take off. And resistance also, I think it's important to remember, occurred throughout the first industrial revolution. Because even though it was sort of the beginnings of the modern era of growth and sustained improvements in standards of living, it took time for those improvements to be felt in, or to be seen in, the pockets of most ordinary people. So even as the British economy took off between 1770 and 1840, wages were stagnant or even falling at the lower end of the income distribution, as relatively well-paying jobs in domestic industries were replaced by the mechanized factory. And again, people rioted against mechanization on numerous occasions. But what the British government did now is actually, instead of siding with the rioters, they began siding with the pioneers of industry, and actually even frequently deployed the army against the rioters. And the army that Wellington took against Napoleon in the Peninsular War of 1808 was actually smaller than the army that was sent out against the Luddites, who went out and smashed machinery in fear of losing their jobs. Now, the point I'm trying to make is not that we're living through the same episode of social unrest all over again. I think it's noteworthy that levels of income inequality in frontier economies have been approaching levels not seen since the first industrial revolution. And the reason for this is obviously not spinning machines and steam-powered factories. It is the declining cost of computational power, which allows businesses to, on the one hand, offshore production to low-cost destinations like China and coordinate production at distance. And it also allows increasingly businesses to automate away non-routine repetitive tasks. And this is something which we see quite clearly when we look at the distribution of income over time. So up until the 1980s, before the computer revolution really took off, and we had the microprocessor and the PC and multi-purpose robots and those sort of things, we see that wages essentially rise at all ranks. But since the 1980s, when automation became more pervasive, we see that wages have been falling for 3 consecutive decades, particularly among prime-age men with no more than a high school degree who could have taken on well-paying jobs in factories before automation took off. And I think it's important to remember that while the labor market was doing quite well before COVID-19, there was significant variation across space and across cities. And many of Americans in Europe's problem, I should also add, are actually where cities have deindustrialized particularly rapidly, and that tends to be the places where industries use more automation technology in production. And in the United States, robots are primarily confined to 3 states. That is Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those were democratic states who've been won by the Democratic presidential candidate every election since 1992. All of a sudden ended up being won by the Republican candidate, President Trump, in 2016. And not without reasons. Those communities have felt a lot of the sort of social ills from automation in terms of persistent unemployment, deteriorating public services, increases in crime, increases in opioid abuse, and so on and so forth. And while much of the public discourse has focused primarily on the exposure to Chinese imports, automation and Chinese import competition has actually had very similar effects on the labor markets. And while we've seen the rise of China already, we haven't seen the end of the automation story so far, because the potential scope of automation has expanded very rapidly only in the past few years. It used to be the case that automation was confined to routine rule-based activities that can be easily specified in computer code and therefore readily automated. But what we're seeing now is that with advances in machine learning, the potential scope of automation is much greater. And a lot of tasks that we used to deem non-automatable, like driving a car, like medical diagnostics, like translation work, those things are looking increasingly automatable. And many of those jobs, like driving a truck, can't be offshored to places like China, but they can be automated. And I think it's a real concern that attitudes towards automation might shift as it progresses, and it becomes clearer that restrictions on imports are not going to solve that problem. According to our estimates, a very significant share of jobs in transportation, in construction, in material moving, in food preparation, in retail, are now exposed to automation as a consequence of recent advances in artificial intelligence. There are 3.5 million taxi, bus, and truck drivers in the United States. There are 3.5 million cashiers which are exposed to technologies like Amazon Go. There are still 2.2 million cashiers which are increasingly exposed to algorithms. And there are also some surprising developments. So one thing that we found in our study, which was published back in 2013, is that fashion models are among the jobs that are most exposed to automation. And what we see is that has actually turned out to be true, because the models that you can see on this picture here, for example, they are actually what's called pictures generated by generative adversarial networks through thousands of pre-existing pictures. They're not real models, but they do have their Instagram accounts, and they're already being used by companies like Dior. Now, automation has historically not been a steady process. It's often come in spurts. And one thing that we do see is that COVID-19 has already accelerated automation. Jobs that are more risk to automation, according to our estimates, have disappeared more rapidly, and so far, at least, they have failed to rebound. And if we look at historical recessions, we find a similar pattern. So routine rule-based jobs, for example, disappeared very rapidly during the Great Recession, when consumers opted for cheaper goods that are produced using more automation technology, and when businesses decided to cut costs and automate rather than rehire, leading to a jobless recovery. Now, even before the pandemic, we saw that sentiment towards automation was changing. And one example of that is dock workers in Los Angeles harbors going on strike because of the introduction of autonomous cargo trucks. More broadly, we saw that the majority of Americans actually favored restrictions on automation technologies beyond hazardous jobs. And what the pandemic has done, if anything, is to increase anxiety towards automation. So even if you look at a country like China, which have vastly benefited from a greater abundance of manufacturing jobs moving to China, we see that before the pandemic, 27% of respondents in China believe that it would be a good idea to impose limits and restrictions on automation. After the pandemic, or during the pandemic, because we're still in it, I should say, 54% would favor putting limits on automation technology. And this is not surprising, because during a recession, people face worsening outside job options. Losing your job to automation, or to other sources of dislocation is worse during an economic downturn because you have fewer job options to choose from. And that's why we saw greater automation anxiety during the Great Depression, more automation anxiety during the 3 post-Korean War recessions, and also after the Great Recession. I think the big difference this time around relative to the first industrial revolution, where we saw similar economic trends, are more in the sort of area of political economy. The Luddites couldn't vote because property ownership was a requirement for voting, leaving most of the population politically disenfranchised. But today, people have the option to opt against things that they don't like. And I think the economist Leontief was onto something when he suggested that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out differently. They could have used a political voice to express concerns over automation, despite the obvious benefits of tractors to the economy as a whole. And I think it's important to remember that while these technologies are likely to bring enormous benefits over the long run, just like the Industrial Revolution did, it can also bring significant dislocations over the short run. And to ensure acceptance for automation, we need to think about policies to smoothen the transition, or we might face similar resistance, which may deny us the long-term benefits of these technologies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Carl. I, especially as someone who was born in the United States, very much appreciate what you had to say and take it to heart. And really glad to hear you talking about it. So thank you very much. If you have questions for Carl, please click the link inside the chat box, and he'll be on video, and you can write your question into the chat box and enjoy. Right now on the session stage, we have a hugely topical panel, Responsible AI and Corona. They'll be looking at the role of AI in the crisis, applications contributing to the spread, vaccines, treatments, and future policies. So be sure to check that out. That's with Virginia Dignam, co-founder and board member of All AI and professor of ethical and social artificial intelligence at UMIA University. Frank Dignam, Wallenberg Chair in AI at UMIA University. Natalie Smuha, researcher, KU Leuven Faculty of Law. Bart Gertz, CEO, Health Plus AI. And the moderator is Cataline Muller, president of All AI. We're going to take a quick break, and I'll be back here at 25 past. Thanks.